So let's talk about motor neuron, motor neuron, sorry, motor unit. It's been a long day, okay? So what is a motor unit? It's a single motor neuron which controls multiple muscle fibers. So the smallest possible motor neuron obviously consists of the smallest possible motor unit consists of a single neuron and a single fiber. Does that make sense? The largest can have thousands of muscle fibers under the control of one neuron. Are we clear? So we can represent our group here. If I'm a neuron and you fibers, it's a small motor unit with 3 fibers. Okay? The point is, whatever signal arrives to the motor neuron, these fibers are going to contract. All going to contract at the same time, the same way. Does that make sense? Obviously, motor units can be small, medium, and large. They're generally divided this way. Does that make sense? Now, for a contraction of a single motor unit, we can describe the contraction of a motor unit in terms of the muscle twitch. Okay? So, it will have 3 phases. I'm going to draw a generic muscle twitch. So you have a lag phase, nothing happens, okay? You have tension phase, and you have relaxation phase. Does that make sense to you all? So, lag, tension. I wanted to use a different color. And here you have relaxation. Now here we're talking about tension. So what happens? During the lag phase, the motor unit experiences excitation part. So all this neurotransmitter release, depolarization, calcium release, nothing happens in terms of the contraction. This is your contraction, tension develops. Does that make sense? And then you have relaxation. When calcium is pumped back into sarcoplasmic reticulum, muscle unit relaxes. Does that make sense? What's important to understand, in different muscles, you can have different motor units with different twitches. Some are slow, some are fast. A good example of a really fast twitch is in your eye, the extrinsic eye muscles. They super fast, okay? Muscles that are responsible for your posture have slow twitch, okay? You can't contract them fast, but the tension lasts for a long time. Is that clear? Make sense? Okay. Now, next what we're going to talk about is factors that can change the force that your muscle develops. Okay? And sometimes we're going to talk about an individual unit. Sometimes we're going to talk about the whole muscle. So, factors contributing to force of contraction. So the first factor is the frequency of stimulation. Okay, this is really simple. This is your old pal, temporal summation. Okay? I'm going to make a couple of really small graphs. So this is the couple of twitches, one after another. Okay? Really weak twitches. Now you're going to overlay them partially. So one twitch, and the next one starts right about here, during the relaxation period. Does that make sense? So what you're going to observe is something like that. And if you keep overlaying the twitches, if the action potential arrives more, with kind of increased frequency, you're going to have this. So the force of contraction will grow. This is called unfused tetanus. If the frequency reaches its absolute maximum, you're going to have fused tetanus. So basically the upper limit here is your absolute refractory period. It basically limits the frequency at which your muscles, at which the individual twitches can overlap. Kind of relating it to your day-to-day experiences, the easiest way to demonstrate it is by gym examples. You go to the gym and you start lifting heavy. And sometimes you really need to focus. So basically you kind of commanding you sending those signals the maximum frequency to the muscles when you want to develop the maximum force. Does that make sense? Second contributing factor is recruitment. It's really simple. If you have a really low stimulus, like low intensity stimulus, not a lot of neurotransmitters really, does that make sense? This is not enough to activate even single motor unit. If even single motor unit is not activated, your muscle is not going to contract. Does that make sense? Now you jump over threshold, you activate one. The more neurotransmitter is released, the more motor units you can activate. Does that make sense? The more neurons, not even just more neurons, the more neurons are engaged into the contraction, the more units are going to be contracting. So eventually, the more units you recruit, the higher the tension is going to be. Does that make sense? However, very practical question. Your muscle, does it have a limited number of motor units? Of course, a limited number of fibers. Which means once you recruited them all, that's it. Okay? So you have a maximum stimulus, maximum recruitment that you can't go over. Does that make sense to you? Okay. And the third factor is hypertrophy of the muscle. This is what I call Duh. Yeah, the bigger the muscle, the stronger it is. It's a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk about it now. But in a nutshell, what happens? Now, you have to understand the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is the process in which tissue produces more cells. Hypertrophy is the process in which cells become bigger. Okay? I'm going to give you a couple of examples. If you don't mind, I'm going to start with hypertrophy. So imagine a person, an athlete, bodybuilder, who's bulking up, becoming bigger and bigger in terms of the muscle size. What happens is each individual muscle cell accumulates more and more myofibrils. It's still one cell, it just expands. Does that make sense? So basically, if you would count the number of cells in that person before bulking and after the bulking, it will be the same. But the size of each individual cell will be different due to the increased number of myofilaments, myofibrils. Does that make sense? Are we clear? Hyperplasia. Can it happen? Well, in skeletal muscle, generation of new muscle cells is extremely rare, so we can disregard it. But it's very common in a smooth muscle. And one of the best examples is uterus. When a woman becomes pregnant, uterus enlarges because smooth muscles start to divide like crazy. Does that make sense? So for smooth muscle, hyperplasia is totally fine. But for skeletal, it's all about hypertrophy. Now, we're going to be sometimes swerving into a little bit of exercise stuff. When people work out, there are two main outcomes for the muscle. Well, three, technically. So number one, increased number of neurotransmitter. Okay? Number two, hypertrophy. That makes sense? And number three, all the connective tissue that we talked about in the very beginning, pyrmecium, epimecium, all that kind of stuff, strengthens, which basically increases capacity of the muscle to lift heavy things. Does that make sense? So, kind of going into the exercise science, obviously, if you take a person who has the same muscle percentage as I have, but 1.5 times bigger than me, there is a pretty good chance that this person can lift more weight than I do. That makes sense? But if you take a person who's been lifting for a while and has better neurotransmitter control over the muscles and stronger connective tissue, I can easily imagine a person of my size lifting 3 times the body weight. Okay? That makes sense? We good about that? Because I'm just trying to kind of partition what we are talking about here. Okay.